I'm gonna welcome you into a story from my own life. And this idea of no hope for change, I want to define it a little bit. This isn't like a no hope, despairing sort of thing. This is a no hope in which it's a situation that just doesn't seem like it's going to change. And I was having problems with an illustration for this, and so I asked Cindy if something came to mind for her, a situation that there's not hope for change, and she immediately said, the attic in our old house. And this involves me, so it's a little bit difficult, but I'm going to explain this, all right? And you can decide who you side with, Cindy or I. I think it's Cindy.
Yeah.
So Cindy says I'm a pack rat. I am an accumulator of keepsakes. All right? Big difference between the two. And I have proof. I have things, I brought some things from the attic. Now, granted, I'm skimming the good things off the top, but I have some.
Right.
These are the things, I couldn't find some of the best things. So, I have a paper that I wrote in 1995 about a correlational analysis of political party and senatorial support of dairy subsidies while controlling for region. This is going to preach. You know? And so keep this in the files, ready to preach on that, all right? So keep that handy. I also have my grandmother's cousin went to normal school in the 1930s. And during that time, she took a class about nature. And so she has this notebook of different birds, different animals, how to swim, all sorts of things. Never know when that might be handy. At my fingertips. No idea. But it could be handy. Coat pegs. Bottle holder. You never know. Popular Science from 1945. Alright? That, you never know when you might want to think about amphibious vehicles of the future. Okay? From 1945. See? Big difference. Not a pack rat. Accumulator of keepsakes. You're with me. You're just taking it in, I can tell. Alright, so think about this. So, 15 years I lived in this house. And when I would get a box of things from a relative or something else, I would look through them, and I'd keep every last drop of it. And I'd put it up in the attic. So after we got married, Cindy would say, why don't you go through these things and keep what's valuable? It's all valuable. Put it in the attic. So it was getting me time to move, and Cindy went up and looked in the attic, and hopeless, because it's packed. But it wasn't entirely hopeless. She said, we'll work out a plan. She's going to work downstairs and organize things, and I'm going to work upstairs. So hours go by, and I'm working feverishly. She comes back upstairs hours later, and I have a big pile of things to save, because what can you throw out, right? And I have a small pile of broken things that could potentially be thrown away. I have a mountain of stuff I haven't even looked at yet. It takes a long time to reminisce and remember as you're looking through things. At that point, hopelessness sets in. For two reasons. On the next slide, there's two things that come with hopelessness.
Christmas story.
Okay. The first picture is a pattern. I have a life pattern of accumulation. Not pattern, accumulation. Just done it over and over and over again. How can you expect that to change? It's kind of hopeless to think that that tendency is going to change. And then there's also the idea of being stuck, in which I wasn't changing when I was supposed to be spending hours cleaning stuff out. I was doing the same thing. I was stuck in the same rut. And that's how it is when we think about change in life, I think. It seems like almost give up on any idea of change, because there's a pattern and because we're stuck. Today we're going to be thinking about sharing our faith, talking about Jesus. And it's hard sometimes to think about that it's really going to change something. That it's really going to change somebody that has lived the same way for decades or years or maybe even months. They've just been stuck in the same spot. we think, I can share my faith, but is it really going to change anything? We have this hopelessness. Now, I want to talk through this passage in Corinthians today to remind us that there is hope for change, for ourselves and for the people around us. So we're going to walk through Corinth. And to do that, I want to get a little history on Corinth itself. So the next slide,
Yes.
we're going to chapter 18 now. We're in Acts. And Corinth is on the Peloponnesian Peninsula that sticks down Achaia. Last week we talked about Paul in Athens. He's walked 46 miles to the west and gone to Corinth. History on Corinth. It's a trade city. There's a trade route running north and south. And east and west, there's actually 2 ports on either side of it. Ships had a hard time going south because of stormy water. They portaged through there. All sorts of commerce.
Right.
2 things that Corinth was well known for. One is wealth, a lot of commerce, and the other is immorality. They were well known for being Corinthians. It was a rough town. That's the history on Corinth. 146 BC, they rebelled against Rome, is destroyed, and sat empty for 100 years. 46 BC, Julius Caesar rebuilds it. And Corinth comes back alive, wealth, and immorality again. So now I want to walk into Corinth with Paul. Paul is walking into Corinth in 50 AD. And you're walking through the streets. It's a Roman city, so it's kind of a rectangular grid. And there's a gymnasium, there's a theater, there's baths, and there's a bunch of temples. One of the temples is to the goddess Aphrodite, goddess of love, goddess of immorality. You're walking through the streets and you see a bunch of seaport sort of people, rough crowd. And if I am Paul walking through the street, I'm thinking, this is not the place for change. What could I really do that's going to make any difference in this town? There's a group of people who are wealthy and all set. What more do they need? There's a group of people who are established in the lifestyle that they have. They're happy. They're not going to change. There's a group of people who are just simply lost. Who aren't even thinking about God. So if I'm Paul, I'm thinking, what's the use? Let's go on to the next slide. So not only is there a pattern, but there's also a stuck nature to the people. In verse 6, we read about how when Paul went in here, the Jews opposed it. The people who should have been most likely to accept Jesus, to think about Jesus, told him to go away. I would be ready to just move on at this point. But Paul sticks on because he sees something that God sees. On the next slide, we got the binoculars. Right? You know what we use binoculars for? You see something you see something kind of fuzzy off in the distance. You know it's there, but you're not exactly sure. But with binoculars, it all stands out. You can kind of see it. That's what's going on here. At the surface, I look at this and I think, Paul, don't stop. Just keep going. It's useless. But he sees what God sees. In verse 10, God says, there are many people in the city who are mine. God is not giving up on these people. He knows there's people ready to turn to him. And Paul's ready to follow that. That's the hope that we have. I think it's oftentimes easy to look maybe at people that are the closest to us. I think they're never going to change. They're never going to be into this God thing. They're never going to understand Jesus. And just kind of give up and shrug our shoulders. But Paul does not. Let's go on to the next slide. There is hope that Paul brings with God's message. The first thing is provision. In verses 1 through 3, when Paul first entered this town, there's hopelessness, but Paul sees people like him.
Yes.
He sees Priscilla and Aquila, people who are Jewish.
Yes.
people who happened to be the same trade that he was, tent maker. They happened to welcome him into their home. A lot of coincidences. And Paul is able to see that God is providing for him, so he doesn't give up hope. Have you ever noticed with the word provision? Like provision is, get stuff, groceries, food. Think of God's provision that way. If you drop a few letters out, you get poison. Have you ever noticed that? Intriguing, I know. That's something you're going to write down, that Carl Green said. All right. It's so easy in our lives to look at God's provision and still only see poison. It's so easy, instead of seeing how God is blessing us, to only see the rotten stuff in life. If we look hard enough, we can always see bad stuff in life. That pops up fast enough. But if we look enough, we can see God's provision. And in this hopeless situation in which Paul has gone into this town that's rough, it's tough, and it just doesn't seem to be a fit, he sees how God has blessed him with friends. Do we think about the friends that God has blessed us with? Think about the people that refresh and renew us. Do we invest in those relationships? Do we put more into those relationships? Or do we just take them for granted? I think a recipe for hopelessness, of giving up on anybody changing, is when we give up on relationships that renew and refresh us. We have to be mindful of investing in those relationships. The example that Paul sets here. Next slide. Okay. For those of you who like these word games, this should be an easy one. It has to do with fishing. Endure. Yes. That's an original. That's my original. So, You guys are a rough crowd today, There's no applause or anything. It's such a good job. Thank you, you have to beg for it. So, Paul is challenged, but he endures. In verses 4 through 8, Paul goes, he talks to the synagogue, he's bringing God's message, and people say no. The Jews tell him no. The people who should be accepting this say, forget you. And so Paul says, well, that's it. Your blood is your own problem. I'm going on. But did you notice what Paul did? He talked. He said, oh, well, this is your problem. He goes next door to the synagogue. He's not in the synagogue anymore, but he's in the house next door. He's reaching the same people. He's changed his approach, but he's still reaching the same people. He didn't give up. On the next slide, quite often, I think that when we meet a challenge, we do two things that Paul did not do. One is we raise the white flag and say, give up. When it comes to sharing my faith, or talking about my faith in God with someone who's close to me, forget it. I've tried it before, it's not going to work. All done. We just give up. Or the other one is we keep doing the same thing over and over again. We think if we hit our head against the wall enough times, we'll break through.
Yeah.
You get a headache, but you're not going to break through. And that's not the approach Paul does here. Paul follows God's direction. He doesn't give up, and he keeps following God's lead. So he didn't continue in the synagogue. He went to the house next door. He went to Titus Justus's house. And the results were dramatic. The ruler of the synagogue became a Christian. A bunch of God-fearers became Christians. He endured and did not give up. On the next slide.
Yes. Yes.
Craig Rochelle wrote a book called The Christian Atheist.
Yes.
And in that he talks about how there are times in which we say we believe in God, but we don't believe that change can actually happen. It's living our lives in contradiction to what we say is our faith in God. And when it comes to change, he told a story, and this story's been told some different directions, about a church that was next door to a really rough place of impropriety. And so the church, they were really distraught about this place next door, so they prayed that God would have it go away, that God would take care of it. And after a while, a natural disaster happened, and the place was gone. The owner of that place found out that the church was praying, and he took them to court. And he said, "You are liable because you were praying that something would happen to my establishment." So in court, in front of the judge, this guy of ill repute is saying they prayed, and God brought about this change because they prayed. And the pastor said, "Oh, wait. We prayed, that's the truth, but we didn't expect anything to actually happen. We were just praying." And so we stepped back and said, "Oh, come on. And so the judge found it funny. He said, "Oh, so the church doesn't believe in prayer, but this place does?" And I laugh at that, but how do I live my life? When I pray that God changes someone's heart, or I pray that God changes something, do I really expect it to change? Do I live like it? It makes me think of traffic lights. I'm a person who likes to anticipate the change of a traffic light. You know, you sit there and you kind of watch the other side so you can see the light, when it's gone from green to red on the other side, you know your light's going to be green. At that point, I'm not looking in the rearview mirror checking for nose hair. I'm ready to go. I've got my foot on the gas. When the light changes, I'm ready to go. Do we do that with prayer? When we're praying that God will change things, is our foot on the gas, or we're kind of like just doing our own thing? There's a big difference between those two.
Agree.
When it comes to God changing people, or God changing us, we should be expectant of honestly believing that God will bring about change. Next slide. So with this idea of hopeless change, we've been talking about provision, endurance. Last thing is personal commitment. The people of Corinth, a bunch of people became Christians, and they still lived in a setting of immorality, a place of wealth. And big surprise, a couple years later, they were kind of going back to old tendencies, kind of being drawn back to those things. Paul writes them a few letters, what we now know as 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Paul writes them and says, come on guys, let's go. And this is part of his encouragement from 1 Corinthians chapter 16. "Be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be men of courage, be strong. Do everything in love." Guard, stand firm, courage, strong, love. Paul is telling them to center their lives on God. That if they really want to bring about change in their own lives, change in the lives around them, center on God. Let's go to the next screen. Another author, one of my favorite authors is John Ortberg. He's a funny writer, I like his things, and he wrote a story about how he went to a funeral, and at the funeral he took a can of ballpark bean soup. It sounded really gross, I don't know. And he said it's rough soup, it's hard stuff. And he went to this funeral, and it was for a friend's mom. It was a childhood friend.
Right.
And this mom had a hard life. Her husband had a number of physical and emotional needs that were hard to meet. They never had much, they never traveled, they were never able to do much as a family. But she always had a welcoming home. Always a welcoming home for he and his friend to go to. And when he went to this funeral, he took this can of soup because it's the soup he always had when he went there, and it just reminded him of this warm home. And when he went to the funeral, the place was packed of people who had had the same experience, in which, despite this person's circumstances, they got to know God's love through her. It's because her life was centered on God. And this is the thought I want to kind of wrap up with, is this idea of how do we center our lives on God? Quite often we talk about prayer time, we talk about devotions, we talk about going to church. Those are important. But what about living our life all the time for God? The last picture here is an accurate depiction of Cindy and I on a date, eating gelato, according to clip art. And it's kind of ridiculous to think if if Cindy and I, if the only times we communicate is when we go on a date, it wouldn't be real often. But you know what I'm saying? It's ridiculous to think the only times that we're going to really have a conversation is when we go out to eat, or when we go do this or go do that. You know, we're talking when we're at the house, when we're working at stuff, when we're driving somewhere, when we're reading books, when we're weeding the garden, when we're cleaning the attic, whatever it is. That time together, it's togetherness. It's not just a date. How often is it that we only think that the time that we spend with God is the date time? The only time that we spend with God is when we go to church. The only time that we spend with God is that 5 minutes we pray when we get up in the morning, or the 10 minutes of devotions we do at the end of the day. God is more than a date. God is our whole lives. When we're at work, when we're driving, when we're doing anything, our time should be centered on God, in which we have God thoughts. Ortberg's quote is, "How many moments of my life today can I fill with conscious awareness and surrender to God's presence?" That's a challenge that I have. How much of my life can I devote to God? Which no matter what I'm doing, it'll still come back to remembering God. Last slide. When it comes to longing for changed lives, whether it's my own life or the lives around me, it's easy to give up hope because of a pattern or because of being stuck. I've got a confession to make about the attic since my parents are here. We didn't clean out the whole attic before we moved. It still had stuff. They brought it in a later trip. Change takes time, but there's hope in it. We can't give up that our lives won't always be the same, our lives won't change. We can't give up on the people around us, that Jesus won't change lives around us. We have to hold on to hope. To see God's provision, to endure, and to be committed to knowing His presence.